I'm going to turn the floor over to my very good friend, Max Bergman. Frankly, I think this is one of the key panels of the whole conference, is this issue of how will EU accession impact Ukraine's economic transformation. I know we're in really good hands with this expert group and with my very good friend, Max Bergman, who's going to lead this discussion. So, Max, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you, Max. Thank you, panelists.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan. And let me encourage all those that are still getting coffee after half an hour to please come in. My name is Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Europe-Russia-Eurasia program and have the distinct honor to be moderating this panel with a truly esteemed panelists. And this is going to be a panel looking at the EU's role in Ukraine's reconstruction. Perhaps for just a bit of context, I think it's really important to sort of go back and think about how we got here for Ukraine. And this war in some ways started in February of 2022, but actually probably started in the summer of 2013, and that's when Ukraine had a choice. And the choice was whether it wanted an economic partnership with the European Union, an association agreement, or whether it wanted an economic relationship with Russia, the Eurasian Economic Union. After a lot of back and forth, the government decided that, okay, we'll not sign on to the EU, and that led to protests, the Maidan Revolution, and the collapse of the government, and the revolution of dignity that brought a democratic government in Ukraine that was Western-facing, wanting to have a European future. And I think what we've seen over the last 18 months is a country desperate to have a European future, and thankfully, I think a Europe that is now increasingly eager to have Ukraine realize that European dream and have Ukraine become a member of the European Union. So, of course, Ukraine becoming a member of the EU has been a hot topic, but that will also have real implications for the future of the EU itself. Ukraine will become the 5th largest member of the European Union, has a huge agricultural sector. They'll have real implications on how the EU is structured on EU funding, and that will potentially require changes within the EU itself. It will also have real implications for the reconstruction of Ukraine. What is the trajectory of Ukraine's membership, how that will interact with the international community, how that will interact with American businesses, with American development agencies and international development agencies. So a lot to discuss, and I'm thrilled to be joined by really an outstanding set of panelists. Now, I'll start by going from my left to right, joined by Anna Palacio, who's a member of the Ukraine Reconstruction Commission. She was the first female Minister of Foreign Affairs of Spain, and is a former member of the European and Spanish Parliament, where she was at the forefront of the debate on the future of the EU and drafted legislation and was sort of at the forefront of many of the legal treaties that became the Lisbon Treaty, which governs the EU, part of the EU Constitution. But Anna's background also, I should say, was part of when Spain was going to become an EU member and the challenges that brought. So, Anna, thank you so much for being here. To her left is Eka Chakashashvili. Eka is also a foreign minister of Georgia, and is now the head of the USAID flagship anti-corruption program in Ukraine, and as well as the president of the Georgian Institute of Strategic Affairs. Of course, when Eka's experience in Georgia also very much involved with the EU, the EU's Eastern Partnership effort, and so brings, I think, a vast amount of perspective on all things Ukraine, EU, and also, I think, a really important perspective of Georgia, a country that is increasingly slipping away from realizing membership of the European Union, unfortunately. Then to her left is Ambassador Paula Dobransky. Paula, thank you so much for being here. Paula was the former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, is currently a senior fellow in the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard's Belfer Center, and I think most importantly, is co-chair of the CSIS Ukraine Reconstruction Commission. So Paula, thank you so much for being here. And then last but certainly not least is Vlad Rashkovan, is the alternative executive director at the International Monetary Fund, who's a former deputy governor and a member of the board of the National Bank of Ukraine, and I think will really give us some good economic perspectives. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have Taras Holub, advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of the Ukrainian government. Unfortunately, was unable to make it, but I think we are in really good and safe hands. Vlad, maybe let's start with you, with both an economics and Ukrainian perspective. How important is EU membership to the future of Ukraine's economy and reconstruction?
Yeah, thanks, Max. And first, thanks for inviting, and thanks to them to be really a true engine of the CSIS work for Ukraine during these 18 months. Really enjoying the discussion with you as well. First, we need to admit and to accept probably that Ukrainian reconstruction, even if started now and not post-war, is a job for a decade at least. So it's a long-term job. And for us today, the same long-term anchor, only now anchor for us, is EU accession. It's a strong anchor, is a strong motivation to do reforms in the country in order to be in the family of European Union. We were discussing today on the first panel, about the Ukrainians who, I think Lena Kasharna was saying, that Ukrainians who left to Poland, to other countries. I think many Ukrainians are already feeling themselves in the EU family. Now we need to make sure that Ukraine as a country will feel as a member of the EU family. And for that, there needs to be done a lot of changes in the country. And the EU accession as a path, as a journey itself, is as much as important as the future target for EU accession. And I strongly believe that Ukraine will be a member of the European Union. And as Ursula von der Leyen was saying in London, during the London conference, that Ukrainian flags will be over the European towns. I strongly believe in that. Second is, Dan was saying today that the reconstruction of Ukraine should be connected with EU accession, strongly connected. And I truly believe that this is exactly the words which we need to use. It should be interconnected, but it should not become an integral part of the EU accession, because EU accession is a political process. Reconstruction is a lot about the economic process. And yes, they're interconnected. Definitely we need to do it according to the EU standards when we think about the roads, about railroads, about the new energy efficiency, green economy, etc. But at the same time, we need to build bridges, we need to build cities, we need to build schools, no matter if people in one of or another European country think what they think about the Ukrainian accession, if they agree with that or not. We still need to continue rebuilding our country, no matter when or how the people in different countries will vote for us. And this is very important. So the reconstruction, not an integral part of the EU accession, but very much interconnected, maybe 70% interconnected to that. And this is very important. Third, the Secretary Pritzker was saying today about the G7 coordination platform, or multi-donor coordination platform, which I think is a great achievement of the last 18 months in terms of the building architecture of the reconstruction of Ukraine and help of Ukraine. And I do hope that it will become not only a platform, but also a decision-making body, because so far they are more discussing rather than deciding. But the fact that the platform has a physical secretariat is good. The secretariat is there, but the secretariat is in Brussels in the European Commission. My feeling, it already creates some sort of a little bit of tension, around the topic of the reconstruction itself, because it's not the only European Union project. Nevertheless, that many people say that US support is a military support for Ukraine and the EU will work on the reconstruction. I don't think so. The reconstruction will be a job for all the countries. It will be a business opportunities, as Sergei was saying in the morning. It should not be, only solely for European Union. We are open for all the world. And therefore, so much association with EU or the European Commission probably may become even a problem in the future. Not now, but may become in the future. And the fourth is what European Union, European Commission did now great is as IMF, we approved the new program this March for $15.6 billion, which is again is the first IMF program in the country of the acting war. And I think it's a big achievement for us. But what is important is what we managed to unlock the 115 billion euro of G7 partners who committed to finance Ukraine in the next 4 years. And EU very fast entered in this commitment, and actually they approved that they are working now with the Ukrainian government on the so-named Ukraine facility for 50 billion euro for 4 years. Is a facility, is a money which should help Ukraine on a path towards the European Union, and also focusing on some reforms, not all of them, but they are clearly very overlapping with the topics of today's conference. And it's not yet the reconstruction plan, but it's a strong economic plan which definitely should help us to prepare for the EU accession, which again also will be a process for some time. It probably will not be for 2-3 years. And it's not, as I said, it's not a reconstruction plan yet, but it will definitely build some elements of that. And while we were discussing with Dan also, with many times on the topic of who may become the next Mr. or Miss Marshall, and shall we have a next Marshall Plan? Now we have Miss Pritzker. Maybe we'll have Pritzker Plan, for the future. And I would definitely vote for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Vlad. Anna, let me turn to you. I think one of Vlad's points, in some ways, that the journey toward EU membership is perhaps, at least from an economic perspective, as important as the destination. Given your experience both in Spain becoming a member, seeing the importance of EU membership for Spain's economy, and then also being involved in the Big Bang enlargement which brought the EU eastward, what are some of the challenges do you see for the EU in bringing Ukraine in?
Well, I think that, first of all, thank you. It's a great honor, it's a privilege, and frankly for the audience, if you want to understand, because it's not easy, and I teach at Georgetown, and I will, by the way, recommend your paper as a
I'll pay you later.
compulsory reading. Honestly, it's not easy to find papers by Americans that get it. I don't agree with 100% with all you just say, but it's very, very useful. So, really, you will have in the paper a response to what you were saying. Because Vlad has said that the process is important, and it is true. And on that, I would say that Spain is a good example, because the fifth enlargement, so the enlargement to Poland, Baltic, the East, is not a good example, because it was an enlargement that was rushed on. In many cases, the criteria, the Copenhagen criteria, you read the paper, but these are the conditions in terms of rule of law, legal security. I mean, they were not met. And we are seeing today the issues that we are having with justice in Poland, not to mention not to go any further, that it was rushed. But in Spain, we negotiated for over 10 years when we had 70% of the GDP of the rich European Union, plus we didn't have to change any of our legal system. Our legal system was there. We didn't have to create a registry for companies or do commercial law. Everything was there. After Franco's death, we had the constitution, and yet we got access in 86. And the transition periods that we had to accept so that the treaty was not enforced were over 20 years. So that's what, nevertheless, this was a formidable opportunity, and Spain changed. Spain changed because it is true in adapting, in negotiating, in the funds. The funds haven't been mentioned, and I agree with Vlad that the funding for Ukraine has to come from private sector. And in general, the funding in Poland, or the economy, all that, it doesn't come. The European funds are just ignite the private sector. Why? Because what this process of accession brings is legal security, is the idea for the world that this is a country where you can work, and you have a justice that works, and you have legal security. But having said that, let's be clear. This is not an accession like any other previous accessions because of the war and because of where we are. And I think that we have to acknowledge what the European Union has already done. It's not just that now it's clear that we are launching a process of enlargement. By the way, it's not just Ukraine. It's Ukraine plus the Balkans plus Albania. The only one that has been left aside is Turkey, and this is something that we have to revisit, at least in my opinion. I'm someone that understands that Turkey, not any Turkey, not in any condition, but a Turkey that fulfills the condition of the European Union is in the interest of the European Union. So it's a different, and it is a different enlargement also because another aspect, which is the fatigue. In your paper, you treat the fatigue, but of course I understand when I travel and they tell me it's because you tell us and we make efforts, but then we don't get the accession, and everybody has in mind the fifth enlargement, not the enlargement in Spain where we were negotiating forever. No, the fifth enlargement, it has to happen already. Yeah, vamos. No, it's not going to go like that. It's not, it cannot. You have a chapter that is called The Elephant in the Room. We need to change the treaties, or we need to have a treaty outside the treaty, but there are institutional arrangements that have to be made. And honestly, we have been reading what is going on in Poland. Poland has gone against the treaty on a technical issue, but that's what is boring for you Americans, is that this is political, but it's very technical. It's that we exist in law, by law, we exist because of the treaty. Anything that happens in the European Union has to be in the treaty. And Poland now has brought Ukraine to the WTO. The problem is that trade is a competition, is in the realm of where we have surrendered our sovereignty, and it is for the European Commission to go forward. And you have seen that there are declarations. All this is creating a very difficult situation, because in Europe, I was the first to be surprised by the unity of the Europeans. Because in Spain, we have no history with Germany, or in that case, with Russia. For us, Russia is Dr. Zhivago and Tchaikovsky, and Dr. Zhivago, the film, not the book. That's the truth. It's like Italy. On the contrary, because we have never had problems, we see Russia in a very romantic way. I was surprised by how we stuck together. But honestly, when people would ask me, I would say, well, we need to tell the Spanish citizens and the Italian citizens that this is European security, and this is where the United States is very important. This is European security, that this is our future, that we cannot just be as a union, as Europe, with an aggressive Russia, that in the end Ukraine is one step, but what Russia is doing is undermining the rules, and we exist by rules. So that's that. But today we have to bear in mind that that the consensus is being broken in these precisely those that are more aware of what Russia is. I was discussing with a Romanian friend and telling me, you know what? We are fed up. We haven't brought to the WTO, but we may. And you know what? They are destroying our roads because there is a lot of trucks coming from Ukraine to get to the ports through Romania. So we need to stick together, but we need to understand the situation of the present European citizens. Of course, as well of the Serbians and especially of the Ukrainians. And I'm coming from Kiev. I was in Kiev last week or the week before because in traveling, I end up not, and honestly, what for me was fantastic is the assurance, the determination of especially of the young Ukrainians. When I would ask them point blank, but your life is there. Hey, wouldn't it better to compromise with Russia? And the response was, you know what? With Russia, there is no life for us. So we are in a very complicated issue. I think that the European Union has taken a very responsible, because it's not for the goodness of our hearts. It's because it is our history, it is our challenge. But the citizens, in a way, they are not specialists in constitutional law, but they understand that there is something that we have to stand for, and I speak for Spain. The problem is that if this consensus starts breaking down in Poland, that is the big bullying ally of Ukraine, if you allow my French, and that is going to be an issue. So we need the help, the contribution of the United States. We need a presence of the United States, because the issue of the United States just dumping Ukraine on Europeans, with the declaration of Vilnius that we may later speak, that I hope that is corrected, because the fifth enlargement happened after all these countries were members of NATO. So after their security was under the umbrella, openly, clearly under the umbrella. Because, you know, with the European Union, we need to correct that. We need to work on our defense, and this is another big challenge. But for the moment, European Union is herbivore, and we depend on the security that is brought by the United States. So we are in it together.
Thank you, Anna. I think I think your point about the grain dispute between Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, and other countries is really on point, because, you know, if Ukraine became a member, the common agricultural policy, which the EU, just the lion's share of the EU's budget, which goes to French farmers and Polish farmers, would almost all go to Ukraine. And so this, and they're starting now, I think, an important conversation in the European Union about it's how it actually gets itself ready to absorb Ukraine. A conversation that didn't quite happen much over the last year, but we're seeing that now with the Spanish presidency of the EU, I think really take that on board. But Eka, I want to turn to you. You're doing a lot of work in Ukraine, but also have a perspective from Georgia, a country that also fought a war with Russia, also sought a path toward European integration, which in some ways seems to be slipping away a little bit. What is your perspective on the role and importance of the EU in Ukraine's overall reconstruction?
Thank you, Max. Sorry, I guess my mic is overly audible. I want to thank Dan for my side as well, not just for today and then all of your colleagues, but being member of the Commission for Reconstruction of Ukraine has been a fascinating journey, really. We had so many discussions that went so deep, and then it's not just the policy papers that are viral out there in terms of how they went out so quick, but then this whole network and then thinking that platform for that you have created. So I'm glad to be part of that, and I'm glad to be today here. Now, I wish I would have been coming from an experience of a country that would know Russia from Dr. Zhivago's perspective or any of the great poets or the writers that Russia had. Unfortunately, we do have a claim of knowing much more intimately what Russia represents and its imperialism, and then how much of a setback historically Russia brought to the region, to countries in the neighborhood of Russia, but then to the continent as well, if we think of that, what Europe could have been if Russia would have been different, and it's a day and night type of the difference that we could talk about. But thinking through the accession of Ukraine and countries that are candidate countries or aspiring countries like my own for the membership of a European Union, and then what is the importance of that, and particularly for those of you who are from America, businesses, private businesses, or just the taxpayers of the US. I think it's a very important conversation for us to have. For us, this process seems so self-obvious, so intimate, so clear why that matters and what will be the impact of that. And we sometimes forget to explain that. Why economics, politics, social fabric, so to say, in the way that how all of that will be developed in our countries would not only benefit, but will transform because of the accession process and membership ultimately. And here I just want to make a benchmark or marker on accession processes that as much as accession to the EU matters, and I'll sort of dwell a little bit more on that, membership to NATO does the same trick, and they go hand in hand when it comes to security and when it comes to the economic and political impact of membership to the EU. Those that have an understanding that one can substitute another are very much wrong on that. Economic and political development cannot be envisaged in a vacuum, especially if you are in the neighborhood where we are challenged by the country like Russia. So security matters. It always has mattered. And then for the future as well, it will have a profound impact on how stable, secure, and prosperous development of the countries like Ukraine could be assured. Now, what it means in terms of a larger picture when we speak about the EU integration process, that is the most profound transformation for the countries like Ukraine to break away from the notion of post-Sovietism. We hate that word in our part of the world when we are defined as the post-Soviet republics. We've been occupied by Soviets for long enough. We are free from that, and we want to have our own agency and then the right to represent ourselves as the countries rather than being branded as either countries that are in the backyard of Russia or post-Soviet countries. Accession to the EU, thank you, and then that level, at least of a candidacy to begin with, makes that breakage final, I would hope. So there's this finality of that at some point, so that we are overcoming that legacy and we're moving into the future with that understanding of where we belong, who we are, and that's countries that are European countries and belong to the European family. That's one. And I have to say here that when we speak about the transformational impact of that, mentally, psychologically, socially, all of us have already transcended that post-Soviet legacy. But what we talk about in terms of transcendence now, it's institutional, economic, structural transcendence, so that all of this malign connectivity with Russian market that be, or anything related to supply chains, as it has been mentioned previously, trade, commerce, we need to break all of that as well, so that Russia becomes a periphery, non-existent now, maybe periphery in the future, but we are geared to the markets, to the economy, to the supply chains. We are becoming essential to those in the future, and that's Europe, and that's the continent. And I have to say that to mirror that, what is the impact of that for Europe? Well, I have to say, and I'm sort of not to be overly critical of strategic acumen of Europe for the past at least 2 decades, Europe suffered from too many blind spots. And then Russia was one of the biggest, because Russia is in the continent, and then Europe, a European continent per se. Enlargement now, this next round of enlargement, and as Anna mentioned, when, in which circumstances that enlargement happens, that how that revives hopes of those who have been potential in this process previously, like Balkans, and then the new candidates countries, offers an opportunity for Europe to reimagine itself as well. So for Americans, for American companies, and then for politicians here as well, making enlargement rights offers an opportunity of having more stable, prosperous, secure Europe in 21st century in a reimagined way, because the old way how Europe functioned is not good enough anymore. And we see this in this modern competitive world, and I don't name now the countries in which we might see that we are competitors or adversaries, and that it's not only Russia. There needs to be strength that comes with that strategic acumen, and enlargement that makes it right in terms of strengthening European Union as a partner to the US as well, as a market and business opportunity for the companies as well when we speak about American companies. Now, if we go to more pragmatic issues related to the EU accession process, and I come from a background of many transformations in my own country when it comes to fight against corruption, in the justice sector as well, in the economic field, but I now being privileged to do that in Ukraine as a head of anti-corruption flagship project, as you've mentioned, of USAID with MSI and Tetra Tech company that I represent here. This is the process that allows all of us in Ukraine to overcome short-termism, if I may call it that way. And that's, there is a paradox in it. I mean, we always rush, and we always had to race against the time in our countries, including in Ukraine, because we had to catch up with so many things. So sometimes we hate it when too much of a long-term planning, strategic things were imposed on us, because we had to overcome challenges today, challenges that were from yesterday, and then deliver already today. So short-term deliverables, seizing opportunities always mattered, and they matter now as well. But if you think about stable, secure development of any country, you need to have an understanding what's out there in the horizon. What is the perspective that allows you to think that it's not short-term, it's not just opportunistic in the way that you need to do what you can now, including for the private businesses, small, big, or mid-sized businesses in that regard, especially for investors from outside, but have a horizon which is predictable and trustworthy. And that's a huge difference for our psyche. We've never had that. We never had a predictability what would come tomorrow, because every other, not decade, but couple of years, Russia either would wage the wars, or would undermine with malign influences our political systems inside. We would just face all of the upheavals globally in our own economies as well when it comes to financial crisis or anything else. I remember when early on in my career, I would have been asked in my job interviews, or when I would go study somewhere, how do you see yourself in 5 years? I was very honest, saying that I cannot give you an answer to that, because my mind doesn't work like that, so that I could really plan in 5 years perspective. I know what happens next year, what happens after, so I have to do my best to reach that 5-year horizon at some point. And then EU accession process, even with its formalities attached to it, how much it frames the process, it forces you and enables you to overcome short-termism. And that is, I think, very important for private businesses who I would hope will be very much attracted to do business and invest in Ukraine, would realize that it's a new era for Ukraine. Upheavals on back and forth was always sort of a legacy for Ukraine. And it's a new era where you can think ahead, have a perspective, data-driven policy decisions that could be made, including for investment purposes. That's one very important takeaway, I guess, from this process. Second is enabling environment. When we speak about anything that relates to doing business in any country, predictability in that regard matters as well. So when we speak about accession process, we speak about an understanding what kind of regulatory environment are we talking about. Now, there is a room of maneuverability, and I would hope that Ukraine will opt for more the best they can do in terms of liberal economy type of regulations there within the European regulatory framework, which can be rigid at times. But irrespective of that, it's clarity, it's the open market economy, it's the level play field for businesses, and it's the good governance, rule of law, and as Anna mentioned, ruled by rules, so to say, and laws environment in which anti-corruption efforts have to be successful and then build on already very significant successes that have been achieved in Ukraine. And then to ensure that for anybody that comes to Ukraine to do business, you would trust what is the environment that you are working in. And that comes with accession process. And no other process could have substituted that for Ukraine. And I'm very glad that that anchoring sort of process and framework is put at place. And I'll finish in 1 minute. I know that I've taken too much time. The challenge that I see in this process is management of expectations from all sides. And then instead of looking into this process from any other precedents that have been set so far for the accession processes, that could be a hindrance to reimagining how differently it could be done for Ukraine and countries that now are to be acceded, just to think outside of the box, be ready for reforms that will be needed within the EU itself, but then think about the process that is result-oriented profoundly rather than only process-oriented, which I do value in itself, but results matter, delivery matter. And then when we talk about bringing back trust to the enlargement process, that reimagining of the process will be needed both for the citizens of the European Union but for the citizens of those countries that have too many precedents of dragged promises. And so that needs to be managed, that needs to be well communicated, and as much as businesses and private sector is included in this process, there's a better understanding for all of you as well how this process will materialize, what will be the role of private businesses in it, and how the reconstruction of Ukraine ultimately will be much more than generally infrastructural reconstruction, obviously, but bouncing back of Ukraine with a completely different potential for the future.
Max, may I have one element to what Eka just said, because I really strongly believe what she said, that EU accession is a strong transformative process really to get rid of the Soviet legacy. And this is not a metaphorical statement. It's very, very practical, because when we speak about rebuilding our cities according to the EU standards, or the rebuilding roads according to EU standards, or changing the width of the railway, or changing even the standards for the food production, or even social policies or attention to the people or to the wounded soldiers or to civilians, it's a completely different philosophy of life which we need to embrace, and through that process and through that journey, but also clearly we're also having result in front of us. This is a way to get rid of the legacy of Soviet Union and to stop naming post-Soviet Republic and to say new European Union members.
It was mentioned, the EU is essentially a body of laws, and one of the challenges for Ukraine versus when Spain joined is that body of law expands year by year by year, and so I think that's oftentimes underappreciated how much Ukraine has to change and adapt its rules in order to have to be on the technical path toward EU membership. Paula, I want to bring you in for sort of an American perspective. So I think we all agree that the EU membership very important for Ukraine's future. But in thinking about this, about the reconstruction of Ukraine, is there a danger that the US, EU, multilateral organizations will sort of all get in each other's ways? Oftentimes when it comes to a big reconstruction effort, us as former State Department people, we're used to calling the shots and being front and center in these decisions. Do you think, what do you think the US perspective is on this, the EU focus here?
First, thank you, Max. Dan, to you and your team, just congratulations. Thank you for bringing us all together. And if I may say, I also have felt very privileged and honored to be a co-chair of CSIS's commission on Ukraine's recovery and rebuilding. And so thank you for that. And one thing that has been terrific about this effort to all of you is that the initial phase was very focused on policies, and we were coming together and debating them. But then, as you said, all right, we have to move. We move from that to implementation. And that brings us here today. So thank you for that. And let me start with actually the report, though, that was issued by the Commission last year, because relevant to EU and EU accession it did state that it's an important a part of this process of rebuilding, and it should be part of the rebuilding for all of the very important statements that have already been made in terms of the transformation, in terms of also by Ukraine becoming a member of the EU. We also know that that will spawn investment, which is a key to Ukraine's success and to Ukraine's recovery. And not only that, thinking about the last panel that was here, the focus on corruption, laws, yourself, you just mentioned it, that also clearly by being part of an EU framework, you know, Ukraine would have to reform itself. So I think there are a number of factors that are absolutely a plus in this regard. For the United States, I think the US is definitely supportive of this, but doesn't see that as the only path forward. And in fact, I think it's been mentioned a number of times, the private sector. The private sector plays a very key role. So regardless of what happens, if I could say, in the international financial institutions or the various regional bodies, you know, the private sector also is looking at their own engagement, many of which are on the ground already, and they want to proceed forward. But there, the key word is insurance. You know, how in going forward, what kind of insurance will we get? What kind of guarantees we will get? So this brings me to a few other points that I'd like to make in this regard. And that is, I think the way the US, and I will say both in government and out of government, I think the vision very much is, this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for Ukraine. It's an opportunity for Ukraine to actually advance, to transform itself, to modernize itself, and also to become solidly in part of the Western community, and a Western community also with Western values. So I want to put that forthrightly. It's also a time of actually looking at Ukraine's success, meaning success in securing its security guarantees, its sovereignty, pushing Russian troops, Russian forces out of its territory, and ensuring that it is able to secure its independence. You have to see it as interwoven. You mentioned it. You want, and we want, rebuilding, but in order to ensure rebuilding, you also have to ensure security. So these issues are very, very much interwoven. You can't really divorce them. But the wonderful thing is, as Secretary Pritzker said, she mentioned winning the war and winning the peace. And here it's very important to win the war and to ensure that Ukraine does succeed and wins this war. And then at the same time, building a framework for itself to advance itself economically. Two last points I'd like to make, and that is, I think that part of this process, and we haven't said enough about it, and I commend your paper as well. I liked it from the US perspective. But one part that I really want to pick out is, you mentioned the importance of reforms by the EU. And that I want to put forward in this conversation because Ukraine, of course, must undertake reforms, but so must the EU. I liked Ursula von der Leyen's statement when she said, this process is a call of history. And in order for it to be a call of history, well, by the way, it's useful to look at the lessons learned from previous processes, but this is a very different one. It's a very different one, and one in which actually there has to be a new path forward, which also requires changes in the treaty. And I do think that, I know there'll be a debate over that, but if one is really meaning to move forward, I think that has to be part of it. And if I may say that the interesting thing to me is that prior to this invasion, you know, when I would hear debates within Europe and many of the Central European and East European countries, when they talked about energy issues in the European context, by the way, there were countless debates over reforms. And how do you move reform forward? So this isn't something new. It just has to be actually done. And in a tragic way, the tragedy on the ground is a forcing event. My final point is just about the backdrop, the strategic backdrop. We are in an era of great power competition. And in this context, I think, and your question was, the US, I think, has done so. The administration has worked very closely with Europe. That doesn't mean we're on the same page on everything, but there has been a unity of purpose. And yes, in the economic trade area, there will be some challenges. But I think one has to look at the overarching strategic issue here, and that issue really should drive even some other maybe differences that might exist in certain sectors relative to trade or, the economic competition, because we are at a time of great power competition, and Europe is an important venue in which to ensure that Ukraine succeeds, because what happens in Ukraine has ramifications not just only for Europe, but for the global community at large.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Paula.
you.
I want to maybe pick up on this kind of issue of the technical versus the political when it comes to EU enlargement, because on the one hand, it's a very technical process. It's a root canal of the EU going through every sector. But on the other hand, it's also a very political process. And I think we've sort of seen some of that tension where, Paula noting that this is a new, important case. Anna, you noting, well, there's a lot of really important technical issues that have to be worked through here. How do you balance that issue?
Honestly, one of the surprises about Ukraine is how it's already changing the way we approach things. Allow me to give you, excuse me, a very simple example. We connected Ukraine grid to the European grid in 4 weeks. So from February, in March it was done. This is not minor issue. To give you the comparison is that the Baltics were still connected to the Russian grid on the same date, on March. And they said, come on, we accepted to be connected on 2025 or 2026. Now, for security reasons, you have to do it. And the European Union did it. There is roaming. This is for the livelihoods of every day. Roaming is already in Ukraine. Sometimes I'm surprised for the good. I think that, of course, when you have a lot of roads, and the acquis communautaire, yes, it's there, but this is a different discussion. But when you have a lot of rules, you tend to have bureaucracy, you tend to have inertias and difficulties to move on. Honestly, what I see is that Ukraine is fulfilling a lot of the not just of the association agreement, but now of the new challenges that the candidature poses. Having said that, I fully agree with Eka that Europe have political black holes. The way Germany depended on Russian gas, frankly, they built Nord Stream 1, when there was already a very clear idea that Russia was a potential aggressor that would materialize its aggression in a big way, because it had already,
and by the way, Ukrainian team was saying about that to European Union.
Not just Ukrainian team, Americans were telling the Germans. The Nord Stream 2 was signed after the incorporation of Crimea. And they did it. And what they would say it even after the invasion. But you know what? This is a commercial. This is a commercial program. Of course, it's true that we have blind spots, but there are big efforts that have to be made by Ukraine, and big efforts in this area of rule of law and certain aspects that are extremely delicate, like, for instance, Russian language. I mean, this is going to be one issue, the protection of minority languages, of course, the issue of corruption, the decentralization. All this is there, and I understand that when you are at war, you tend to have all the power in one hand, and it makes sense. But we have to balance, and we have to contribute, balancing in a positive way, in a constructive way, this necessity of war times, that it's to have a commander-in-chief, and that this commander-in-chief says and does, with the fact that we are already preparing this overcoming Soviet memories or Soviet approaches, and just this being at the forefront of what is transparency and a rules.
Can I just pick up on that, and then we'll go down the line? But it strikes me as that the wartime situation creates both a challenge. You're focused on the war, that is the drive, but also an opportunity, because you can move very quickly. There's a real sense of unity. Passing laws, changing things can happen very quickly. Eka, and then Paula, and then we'll go.
I'll speak from the perspective on the ground. We're in it sort of every day, right? There is an unprecedented level of renewal of the social contract in Ukraine right now, and that comes close to the question of politics versus technical capacities, right, or how they work together. All of the latest public opinion polls that we've conducted, and some other projects from the US side or from the European projects as well, identifies very clearly that despite of the war in Ukraine, people of Ukraine predominantly even consolidated their vision, commitment, and understanding what matters when it comes to transformation of the country. And I just have to say that top two in terms of the priorities in this country is now providing rule of law and fight against corruption. Not just the security of the country and winning the war, because winning the war is associated with the vision, what is the future for which you are fighting for is actually. And that's a European country with good governance, stable and prosperous economy, transparency, and predictability of the legal environment. People are fighting for that concrete vision, clarity of that, rather than just fighting against Russia per se. And it's a very important factor, because anything that we talk about in terms of transformation, it's not driven by allurement of potential candidacy or not potential, but then candidacy or the membership of the EU, or because of the foreign conditionalities, even though they help in terms of how far you can go with some reforms. But it's an inherent drive and commitment of the people of Ukraine that are pushing their own government and then political leadership in this direction. And that is the biggest indicator one can have in terms of sustainability of that effort, of overcoming that short-termism from within, so to say. But then when we speak about the social contract, there is a lot that needs to be done with external sort of actors there as well. For far too long, we've suffered with ups and downs, and by we mean countries in the neighborhood, and Ukraine is not an exemption of that, of having help and commitment, and then some of that being withdrawn over the time, and then not having predictability of how sustainable that involvement, engagement, and investment would have been working hand in hand, so to say, in this direction. Europe suffered quite a lot in terms of not destroying, but then undermining trust in Europe's word and credibility with enlargement processes for the countries that have been in this game for a long time now. And Balkans, good example. Turkey has been mentioned by Anna as well. And now we have this renewal, 2030 being mentioned as a time frame there as well. So I think big portion of how that balance will be maintained between political will and then the technocratic element of how this process will be pursued will be defined by readiness of the political elites, so to say, and businesses as well, by the way, to commit to that renewed social contract in Europe, as a European social contract, that Europe has an ambition to be a relevant actor in global affairs, to reimagine its own role in global trade, commerce, and economy, and then build up its own muscle with this enlargement when it comes to where Europe could stand by contributing in transatlantic realm, so to say, in this era, which, I mean, Paula, you mentioned that we are in this competitive era. It's not going to fade away. So either you are shaping your own future, or you are, most of the time, reacting to others that are filling the vacuum and shaping it for you. So do we want to be in the position in transatlantic realm, so to say, that we are on top of the game so that we know how we are shaping our own future? We depend on what the life will bring every other sort of year or decade, and then be on the fringes rather than in the front lines of reimagining that future in 21st century with all of the technological advancements and everything that needs to follow. So, sorry again, I'm talking too much. That's my tendency, I guess. But a final word on that. It's very dangerous when lack of political will is camouflaged by the necessity of technocratic processes. And then when just processes and technocratic formal rules are used just as an excuse for having a lack of commitment to move forward. And I only wish that now we're facing a different situation, and that's my take at least for now, and I want to be optimistic in this, that we don't have that as a challenge, but rather real challenge, how to make technocratic formalities work, while at the same time maintaining and strengthening political will behind it, so that we do have in 21st century a renewal of that social contract within the countries in Europe, but then across Europe as well when it comes to the common social contract of the belonging, so to say.
Okay. Paula.
Just 2 points.
No.
First, with regard to Ukraine and the mood in Ukraine. As I look out in this audience, there's so many Ukrainians here who've been to Ukraine, and you know that it has shifted in terms of the goals, the objectives. People see in this tragedy and in this brutal invasion an opportunity, and they're committed to do it. So no question about it being 100% political will. There's no question about that in my mind, and from my visits there and from all of those who we've interacted with. But the focus I'd like to comment on and why I jumped in was more about Europe when you asked that, and about EU in this case. Is it political? You know, where is the tension? And then the technical. And for this, I do think that when I look at Ursula von der Leyen, her statement about a call of history, well, that means there has to be reform. That means that has to be a different movement. Europeans have cited also the fact that Ukraine is out there. So is, by the way, Moldova and Serbia. And they're over to the side. You know, they've applied. So the issue here is, yes, one has to move past technical obstacles, look at ways forward, and in fact, if you do call it a call of history, then you take the kinds of necessary steps to move on it, plain and simple. And I think that's the kind of push that has to be made here. There are some very strong supporters in the EU who I think are willing to show that leadership and move it forward. And I'm not making light of some of the technical processes, but there are also ways, I think, of getting around this. Because my last point will be, I think also, just like I happen to be a strong proponent of Ukraine, Ukraine's desirous, long time ago, of being in the EU, long time ago. So this is not new. But Ukraine also wants to be a member of NATO. And by the way, I want to inject that in this conference, is that next year, 2024, the United States is the host, actually. I would like to see, not what we exactly witnessed in Vilnius, I'd like to see a clear statement that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. That provides, thank you, that provides the greatest and clearest security guarantee for Ukraine's future security and for this very issue of this conference for rebuilding.
I think that's a great point. It's partly the enlargement, the Big Bang enlargement of 2004. Well, prior to that, you had NATO enlargement that then set the predicate. But Vlad.
Yeah, Max, just leveraging exactly what Ambassador Brent said and what Eka was saying before, and what Lena Kasharny was saying before, I would say that today the biggest investment what we can do for the Ukrainian reconstruction as of today would be Patriots, HIMARS, and ATARMS. You know, more we will have security today, we will have an Abrams. Yeah. More security we'll have today, less we need to rebuild tomorrow. And while tomorrow is clearly it will be a call of history also for the NATO membership, and we will be able after that to focus on technicalities, you know, of the bureaucratic process, which is also important. First thing. Second thing, I fully agree with Ambassador, is that this should be a two-side road. You know, we go now to Europe, and also, as Eka said, Europe also should reimagine itself, and what Anna was saying. The third, what Eka was saying before, the EU accession also a way not only to overcome our legacy, but also really to overcome our short-termism, which is, again, pretty obvious during the war, but we need to think longer. And we need to create this vision of Ukraine, which will be, you know, after the war and within the European Union, because it is clear we will not be looking like Poland or we will not looking like Spain. We will look like Ukraine as a member of the European Union. What kind of Ukraine depends on us. This cannot be brought from outside. This is Ukrainian view. And, you know, just to understand, it's a difficult process, you know, to build up the shared vision of tomorrow is difficult. Maybe if you will close the eyes now, and there are some Ukrainians here, and will think about one thing, how you see Ukraine. You know, I'm sure you will see different things. How to build up all this together, this is a process which we still need to go through, and I hope we will. And the last thing is, this conference is a lot about the private investments. And I do hope that while we're working today on reconstruction, when we hear tomorrow and today that we will rebuild, it means it will be not rebuilt by the state. Because I agree with Anna, it's important that you have now like a more state economy, more state leadership during the war. If you add there that there was a COVID before, you know, where also the role of during the pandemic, the role of the state was increasing. During the war, the role of the state would be increasing. I mean, we don't want to go towards Russia in terms of the role of the state. We need to go towards Europe, to the role of the private sector. So I want with us to hear tomorrow, we will rebuild. It means that we will rebuild by the private sector, you know, by European, Ukrainian, American, Asian, other Latin American companies, and this is what we need to strive for. And again, thanks for this conference to make this also a platform for discussing that.
Thank you, Vlad. We have about 10, 15 minutes left, so I'm open to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll get you a microphone, I believe. I see Anders.
Anders, it's at
Or
the back.
it's a stationary mic.
It's
Sorry.
oh.
Or no, now it's portable. Right behind you, Anders. Oh, so if you have a question, actually, there's a mic, sorry, back there in the back.
Yes, it works. I have a question to Anna Palacio. Thank you very much for presenting all the problems of the grain issue now between Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary on the one hand, and Ukraine on the other. I have a simple question. How do you think it should be solved?
And if you could introduce yourself on this.
Sorry, Anders Åslund, Stockholm Free World Forum.
Well, how should it, I think that part of this, in particular for Slovakia and for Poland, is an electoral move. It's just to create. The problem is that this creates bad blood, and this has consequences. How to proceed in the European Union? The way the Baltic proceeded. When I explained to you the connection of Ukraine, and then they went. They didn't make a fuss. They didn't go and protest openly. They went to the corridors of the European Union and they say, hey guys, look, we have this problem. I mean, it cannot go. And this is the security of Europe. And the institutions reacted in a positive way. We are at a very difficult situation with Poland, because Hungary, we take it for granted. This has other implications for the enlargement, is that, frankly, there is a perception. All the time, we understand and we commend the position of the accession citizens. And they can be disappointed and this and that. The problem is the citizens that we have in the European Union that are voting more and more for extremist parties. By the way, it's the same problem that you have here in the United States, that don't want to be committed. This is true. AfD in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, in France, everywhere. What we have to understand is that you cannot just make a big brouhaha against the European Union, because this is just, it has no cost. There has to have a cost. And the way to go in the European Union is always to negotiate in the corridors. I understand it's not exciting, but this is the way to go. And frankly, Ukraine is doing good in these aspects. Instead of creating just tensions, I mentioned, and we have to address this, even in the issue that probably is today the most contentious, which is minority languages, Russian in particular, they are doing it in the way it's efficient to do things in Europe.
If I may just add, Anders, it's not from the perspective of what the EU could do and then how in that sense that could be resolved. But to me, the obvious choice in the long term is just to have a real strategy of security for the Black Sea. Ukraine never needed to transport or sell anything when it comes to the grain so far necessarily through Hungary or to Poland. Economically, it's not the most profitable to begin with as well, but because of the blockade that Russia instituted on the Black Sea area and then destruction of the ports, the grain silos and all of that, that's what we are facing with right now. But eventually, for the good of EU, for the good of so many countries in the global south that have suffered because of the lack of the supplies from Ukraine that has been feeding, in that sense, so many countries that are poor in global south as well. That's what needs to happen. There needs to be freedom of navigation. There needs to be the real security on the Black Sea, even prior to Ukraine joining NATO, and that needs to become a real agenda, so to say, in terms of guaranteeing that. Some of the signs that we see now, again, are initiated with this agility and sort of readiness to act from Ukrainian side by already having some testing shipments going in the way that some of the countries individually are trying to secure, more or less. And it's not only Turkey, but then we've heard about UK. I'm not privy to all of the sort of security details on that front, but we see that there is this movement constantly from Ukrainian side to ensure that the Black Sea remains to be open for navigation. Part of what you could do to reassure some of the countries that take more of a burden right now, countries like Bulgaria, countries like Romania, for example, and I mentioned some of it when it comes to the roads. These countries are not rich countries. They do have their own economic issues, upcoming elections in the countries like Romania, and then some concerns with some part of the political spectrum that could overtake the leadership role in the country. So how you could see how they can help with either compensating unnecessary ratio of the damage to infrastructure that the country would have never had, but they do now because of the traffic, because of the loads of goods that are transported to those countries. One can alleviate potential crisis in the future by having preventative measures being somehow applied prior to that. And then finally, in this regard, I guess something that I just wanted maybe as a summative small statement from my side to mention, especially for those of you who are from private businesses here in Ukraine, something that dramatically makes Ukraine distinct from so many countries that, I'll just use for once this use of post-Soviet space, is that it's very inherently entrepreneurial. Somehow, I guess, built in so many ways with this historical civic culture of the cities and then the way that it has been governed. That is the magic of resilience of Ukraine that Russia never understood because Russia never had it. Russia is always a hierarchical country from the times of the Mongol Khanates and then after that as well. This is how their psyche works in terms of how they are governed. They don't understand that civic movement, engagement, on the ground connectivity could be effective. So that decentralization of power in Ukraine with communities, their resilience and agility is very entrepreneurial when it comes to the business. The main psyche, so to say, in Ukraine for people, and that can be surprising for those who knows, some countries from the socialist background, when you ask for more from the state all the time so that somebody takes care of you, free of charge, everything, this and that, if anything can be free of charge in anything. In Ukraine, it's very different. The psychology is that don't interfere, let me be, I'll do my job and I'll be prosperous. And I think that's the perfect environment for the businesses to have in terms of partnerships with those who represent Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian people as the human capital on the ground. It's a profoundly free-spirited, free market economy type of mindset that is very much reliant on itself and can be a very reliable partner in this case when it comes to how agile, creative ideas could be well tapped into and then realized as the potential.
I think that's a very important point. Just one quick thing on the Black Sea. I think the Ukrainians are also working to resolve this militarily by opening up the Black Sea and ensuring free and open navigation. I see that Odessa is now being able to ship grain, and their naval attacks and pushing Russian naval vessels away, I think, is critically important because then that's the most economical way for grain to get to market. I see we have a question. Do we have two questions? Maybe we'll take them back to back and we'll close out. Please.
Hi, Doug Brooks with FGI Solutions. We have an office in Lviv. We're doing shipping and logistics and vehicle leasing. Great panel. I think the worst case scenario that we might have to face is a continued low-level conflict. So we achieve some point of victory, I guess, but the Russians don't surrender, I guess, or don't stop the war. How do we ensure that the European Union will stay committed to Ukraine and to a long-term Ukraine independence in this kind of situation?
Great, thank you. And do we have another question, or I think
Yes,
we'll...
over there.
Yes, please. I think you may have to move to that mic. Oh, good.
Thanks for the lively discussion, by the way. This is great. Speaking of EU membership and NATO membership, and bringing up the Black Sea and Turkey, and maybe Madam Ambassador will get on this, do there need to be any accommodations to Turkey? They've been waiting for EU membership for quite some time, and they own the entrance to the Black Sea and have a lot of impact. They're just wanted on thoughts on Turkey.
Okay.
Well, I'll give a very quick answer to that one. First, President Erdogan, by the way, was up at the UN just this past week. He not only delivered I believe he already delivered his remarks, but he also took the time, by the way, to appear in two fora. One was an organization known as Concordia, where he had a fireside chat. That wasn't a question that came up, but I will tell you that the Turkish Center held a roundtable discussion with a number of NGOs. Turkey has made the request for longstanding of its interest in the EU, but you know what? It's not for the United States. We are not the ones who make that determination. We have, though, valued, I will say, Turkey's involvement on the grain deal. I think, and actually at the beginning of his remarks, he did cite that this was something that Turkey was very committed to helping Ukraine on. And I think they've shown the direct action in this regard. But really, your question should be on the European side here, because talking about political will and processes, I mean, Turkey has not been brought in, and I think you know the reasons. But the United States has valued Turkey's engagement, I would say, in the practical ways, especially on the grain deal. in this case?
We have just a couple minutes left, so we'll be very quick and also hitting the first question on what should the U.S. do to keep this up?
I'll just with the first question, maybe a bit of a reflection of the conflict-related question. I don't believe in the potential myself of simmering war continuing for a long time. I guess none of the sides have a possibility to maintain or sustain that kind of an operation. Russia might try to recuperate and then perhaps do something large in the future, but then continuous conflict in that way is rather hard to maintain for all sides. I think part of the problem lies with us, and with us I mean international community maybe at large, with, again, reimagining or destroying the myth of Russian invincibility. Ukrainians are proving day to day, every day, that myth of invincibility was indeed a myth. So you can fight Russia, you can confront Russia, you can be successful in doing that. You need all the equipment that is needed for that to be shortened time-wise in terms of having a success. And the biggest marker for me when it comes to transformation from war to peace, and by peace, I don't mean that Russia will sign any peace agreement, but de facto peace that needs to be established will be overtaking Crimea, which Ukraine has all the capacities to do it if all the gear and equipment would be provided to Ukraine. But in that regard, Crimea is a linchpin of how the peace could be established, how peace and security in Black Sea could be. I'm not a military expert. I listen to those who are, including Ben Hodges, for example, that has very clear view from tactical point of view how is that achievable. So I don't like when non-military experts, people who don't know anything about military, say how it is impossible to take Crimea. Please do listen to the generals and those who are actually well-equipped with knowledge and experience when they say that it's possible and what is needed for that to be possible. And Ukraine is already making partial enable for Russia to keep Crimea in this regard. So, and finally, with the U.S. sort of role into it, we need to have sober understanding, I guess, and I say this as a Georgian, that for at least a decade, at a minimum, we will have a Russia that needs to be contained. There will be no quick internally the dissolution of Russia or regime change of the kind that will make Russia a civil partner of any kind. No business usual definitely would be possible unless we surrender our values and principles to Russian imperial attempts right now to impose their own vision of the future on us, which means that it's a painful realization, but we need to understand that containment policy and deterrence policy of Russia should be a pivotal element of our vision to the future, which means that strengthening, even before membership to NATO, of Ukraine's security capacities and then containing Russia in the territory of Russia, that's the only solution, so that Russia has no possibility of spilling over its own mess, so to say, on the countries in its vicinity or far away like Syria, but still, or Africa. Yeah. And it's contained, it's deterred, and we do the job of strengthening variables and working on elements that we are in control of, rather than thinking how we can change Russia, which we never could and we will never be. All we can do is strengthening ourselves, and by that, potentially changing Russia in the future. And let's concentrate on ourselves.
And by the way, I mentioned Ukraine, NATO. Georgia should be in NATO too.
So we are at time. So Dan is giving me the stink eye. So
one minute. The length of the war depends on many different factors. First of all, from Ukrainian military forces which are on the ground. We don't ask, other boots to be on our ground. We do our job there, and the Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian volunteers, Ukrainian army does the job fighting with the army, which others are afraid to do now. Second is, it would be helpful to help in this process, not only from military, not only for budgetary support, but also maybe stopping, also in European Union and many European countries, to think that now when there is a war in Russia, that they occasionally found very interesting markets in Kyrgyzstan, in Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, increasing their export in those countries 10, 15 times, and closing their eyes that they are pretending they don't know where this export goes, because for that they do support the war, unfortunately, and we need to work on that. Because it's a question of who will be more exhausted, and we really need to make sure that Russia will be more exhausted in this war. And the second is, you should be also brave enough, like Ukrainians do, Ukrainians are, in order to working on the Russian assets. You know, the frozen Russian assets in Europe, this money will be very much helpful for Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll get there.
Great. Well, I want to thank our panelists. One second.
On Turkey, I think that there is an opportunity now. We are rethinking the way to enlarge, and Turkey has also to just be a real candidate to comply with the Copenhagen criteria. So I think there is an opportunity now. On Ukraine, frankly, the outcome of the war is something that worries not just the European Union, America in the first place, and I will join those that have said that for the moment, we have to be there, and to be there with as many arms, as sophisticated, as powerful that are needed, because this is how we are, how our future is playing. Our future, not just the European Union, the West, the way we see the world, the rules-based order as we understand it. And as you know, I'm referring to Putin's statements.
Yeah. And I think one thing that for the United States, this is an EU process. On the other hand, we need to help keep the political momentum. I really want to thank you all. I want to thank also Dan Rundy and his team for organizing this conference. CSIS is oftentimes a very siloed organization, and we sit in our programs, we don't really work with each other down the hall. And this has been a great opportunity to really work and get to know Dan and his program, and they've been fantastic. And I want you all to join me in both thanking Dan, but also our great panel. Thank you.